What if a prestigious medical institute used human test subjects like disposable lab rats? What if the person you trusted the most betrayed you? When a Manny's twin sister, Maya, mysteriously dies, no one believes her death was foul play, except Manny. But when she infiltrates Ashton Biotech, she uncovers a truth far worse than she ever imagined. How far will she go for justice? Find out in today's story on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories. The city lights flickered through the blinds, casting faint shadows across the tiny apartment as Manny Brooks pushed open the door, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Her muscles ached, her knuckles still bruised from the night's fight, but none of that mattered. Not tonight. Tonight was for celebrating. She had done it. Another victory in the ring. Her coach had been beaming, her opponents were nursing their wounds, and she had walked out with another step closer to the championship. But more than anything, she just wanted to share the moment with her twin sister. Maya, Imani called, kicking the door shut behind her. You better not be knocked out in front of those damn science papers again. I swear you. She stopped mid-sentence. The apartment was too quiet. No faint hum of the laptop, no shuffling of research notes, no smell of the burnt coffee Maya always made late at night. Just silence. Imani's stomach twisted. She tossed the duffel bag to the side and stepped into the living room. The lamp was still on, casting a dim yellow glow over the room, and there, curled up on the couch, was Maya. Her head was tilted slightly, dark curls spilling over her face, her arms resting limply by her sides. Too still. Maya. Imani's voice cracked as she stepped forward, her breath shallow. Come on, sis, you're gonna kill me if you fell asleep before I could tell you about the fight. Nothing. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Maya's hand, ice cold. A sharp gasp tore through Imani's chest. No. No, 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 no. Her hands shook as she grabbed Maya's shoulders, shaking her gently, then desperately. Maya, wake up. Still nothing. Her mind raced. CPR, call 911. Do something. But her body felt paralyzed, frozen by the sheer wrongness of it all. Her twin sister, her other half, was just gone. It wasn't until she tried to lift Maya's arm that she saw it. Dark bruises, needle marks. Imani's breath hitched. Maya hated needles. Even when they were kids, she'd fight tooth and nail to avoid getting shots at the doctor's office. She never took injections, not for pain, not for anything. So why the hell were there needle marks on her arms? A deep, unsettling chill crawled up Imani's spine. This wasn't right. This wasn't just some medical emergency. This wasn't a random accident. Someone did this. She didn't remember grabbing her phone, but suddenly she was dialing 911, pacing the room like a caged animal. Her heart pounded against her ribs, rage and panic mixing into something too big to contain. 911, what's your emergency? My sister, she's not breathing. She's cold and there's... Imani squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the words out. There's bruises. There's needle marks on her arms. She never. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. Can you check for a pulse? Pulse? There wasn't one. Her throat closed. She's gone. A beat of silence. Then, stay on the line. Paramedics are on their way. The flashing red and blue lights painted the apartment walls in harsh streaks as uniformed officers filed in behind the paramedics. Imani stood in the corner, arms wrapped around herself, heart slamming against her ribs. They worked quickly, too quickly, checking vitals, pronouncing Maya dead, zipping up the body bag. Imani's stomach twisted at the sight. It felt too final. She was murdered, she said, her voice raw, barely above a whisper. One of the cops, Detective Harrington, a middle-aged white man with a tired expression, glanced up from his notepad. Ma'am, I understand this is difficult, but there's no sign of foul play. Imani snapped her head toward him. No sign of, look at her arms. Harrington barely glanced at them before shrugging. She was a researcher, right? Working with chemicals, drugs, maybe it was an accident. Imani took a step forward, fists clenched. Maya never used injections. She was terrified of them. Those marks, someone did this to her. The detective sighed as if he'd had this conversation 100 times before. Listen, I get it. You don't want to believe she was using. She wasn't, Imani growled. But the tox report will tell us everything, he continued, completely ignoring her. And from what I can see, overdose is the most likely scenario. Overdose. The word slammed into Imani like a gut punch. No, she whispered. No, that's not. Maya wouldn't. Harrington shut his notepad and gave her a practiced look of sympathy, the kind that wasn't real. The kind that said, this case is already closed. Ma'am, I understand this is hard for you. But you should take some time to grieve. There's nothing more to do tonight. Imani stared at him, disbelieving. They weren't going to investigate. They weren't even going to try. She wanted to scream, to punch something, to break every bone in Harrington's smug face. But none of that would bring Maya back. So instead, she swallowed the rage, letting it settle deep in her gut. They weren't going to look for answers, but she would. The next morning, Imani sat in Maya's room, running her fingers over the desk, the books, the neatly organized notes. It still smelled like her, lavender and ink and something soft, something comforting. But none of it felt real anymore. Her sister was gone. Her heart clenched as she picked up a photo from the nightstand, the two of them grinning like idiots, arms around each other, matching dimples on full display. Maya had believed in science, in facts, in proof, and Imani. She believed in fighting for the people you love. Her sister hadn't overdosed, she had been killed. And if the police weren't going to find the truth, Imani damn well would. She took a deep breath, eyes burning with determination. She wasn't just going to sit here and grieve. She was going to war. The scissors hovered above the bathroom sink, glinting under the dim fluorescent light. Imani stared at her reflection, her dark curls wild and untamed after a night of restlessness. This was it. Her fingers tightened around the handle before she took the first snip. Snip. A chunk of hair fell into the sink. Then another, and another. By the time she was done, her natural curls had been cut to a sleek, professional bob, just like Maya's. She ran a shaking hand through the new style, staring at herself in the mirror. The resemblance was uncanny. Her heart clenched. She wasn't just stepping into Maya's shoes today, she was becoming her. The lobby of Ashton Biotech was pristine, too pristine. White walls, white floors, white people. Imani adjusted the stiff white lab coat draped over her shoulders. It still had Maya's ID badge clipped to it, her full name, her title, Dr. Maya Brooks. Damn. It felt like a betrayal, even though she knew Maya would understand. As she stepped inside, she kept her shoulders squared, her head high. She had spent the entire night studying Maya's mannerisms. The way she walked, the way she held her notepad, the way she adjusted her glasses even though she didn't need them. She couldn't afford to mess this up. She made it past the front desk without issue, moving with the same quiet confidence Maya would have. But the moment she stepped into the main research floor, she felt it. The stares, the tension. It was like she had walked into enemy territory. A thin white woman in a navy blue blazer narrowed her eyes. You, clean up the mess in Lab 3. Imani blinked. Excuse me. The woman scoffed, not even bothering to make eye contact. Don't act dumb. The spill in Lab 3, go handle it. And after that, scrub the restroom near the break room. It stinks. Imani felt her fingers twitch. She could knock this woman out in 3 seconds flat, but she wasn't here to fight. Swallowing the sharp burn of humiliation, Imani nodded stiffly. Got it. One step at a time. She followed the hallway signs until she found the break room. It was lunchtime. Researchers huddled in small groups, laughing, eating, ignoring her, except for one thing. She spotted the restrooms at the far end of the hall, 2 doors, one labeled staff, the other labeled custodial and maintenance. Her stomach turned. Maya, Dr. Maya Brooks, a biochemist at a world-renowned facility, hadn't been allowed to use the same restrooms as her white colleagues. A sharp sting of anger burned in Amani's chest. Her sister had walked these halls every day. She had worked here, suffered here. And she had never said a word about this. Why? Because she had been too used to it. The realization made Amani's stomach twist even harder. Before she could turn away, 2 white male researchers passed by, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. Carter called for her again, one of them murmured. Again, the second guy smirked. Damn, he must really miss her. They both laughed. Amani's fingers curled into fists. The first guy shook his head, taking a sip from his coffee. She's so lucky, man, getting all the special treatment while we do all the real work. Yeah, the second sneered. Bet she's real grateful for it too, making sure she earns her keep. A slow, burning rage spread through Amani's gut. They were talking about Maya. She forced herself to breathe, to not let her hands shake, to keep walking, because the worst was yet to come. The first guy sighed dramatically. Honestly, I don't even know what Carter sees in a low-class black girl like that. Amani's body went cold. She stopped walking. For a split second, she saw red. She wanted to spin around and slam his smug face into the nearest wall. She wanted to make him eat those words, but she didn't. She couldn't. She just clenched her fists tighter, nails digging into her palm, and kept moving. Not yet. By the time she got to Maya's lab, her pulse was pounding in her ears. She needed air. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her, finally allowing herself to breathe. But as she looked around, something hit her like a punch to the gut. Maya's desk was untouched. Her notes, her laptop, her research files. Everything was still there. They hadn't packed it up. They hadn't cleaned it out. Because to them, Maya wasn't gone. To them, she had never mattered in the first place, and that was going to change. Amani took a slow breath, the fire in her chest growing stronger. She wasn't leaving without answers. She wasn't leaving without justice. And most of all, she wasn't leaving until Miles Carter paid for what he did. Amani's stomach churned as she stood outside Miles Carter's office. The message had come suddenly, a clipped command from one of the senior researchers. Carter wants you in his office. Now. She wasn't ready, not yet. She had planned to gather more evidence, to slowly uncover the truth, to wait for the perfect moment. But now she had no choice. The brass nameplate on the door gleamed under the fluorescent lighting. Miles Carter, director. She clenched her fists, sucked in a slow breath, and pushed the door open. Miles Carter was already watching her when she stepped in. The man was in his early 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, and dangerously relaxed. His expensive suit was crisp, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back. But it was his eyes that made Amani's skin crawl, sharp, calculating, and filled with amusement, like a predator watching its prey. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers tapping against the armrest. "You're late," he said, voice smooth as silk. Amani swallowed down the bitter taste of rage. She had to be smart, had to play along. So she lowered her gaze, just like she had seen Maya do in old photos, quiet, obedient. "Sorry, sir," she murmured. Miles's lips curled into a slow, twisted smirk. Then he said the words that made her entire body go cold. "What are you waiting for? Get on the bed." Amani's spine went rigid. For a moment she thought she had misheard. But no, Miles was still watching her, head tilted, waiting. Like this was routine. Like this had happened before. The room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. The plush leather couch in the corner of the office, the one he was referring to as a bed, sent a violent shudder down her spine. Was this what Maya had gone through? Had she stood in this very spot, frozen in fear while this man ordered her around like she was nothing? Imani's hands itched to wrap around his throat, but she forced herself to stay still. Stay calm. She couldn't blow this. Not yet. So instead, she forced her legs to move, her steps slow, deliberate. She sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, muscles coiled like a spring. Miles let out a dramatic sigh. Don't be so stiff. You act like we haven't done this plenty of times before. Plenty of times. Imani's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about her sister being forced into something against her will. This was worse. So much worse. Then, instead of touching her, Miles reached into his desk drawer. Imani's body tensed, every nerve screaming at her to prepare for the worst. But when he pulled out a pair of latex gloves, confusion momentarily clouded her fury. She barely had time to react before he reached for a syringe. A chilling numbness crept through her veins. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Miles chuckled, shaking his head as he slipped on the gloves. "Don't act dumb. This was the deal." The deal? Something hot and ugly twisted in Imani's gut. She had expected him to try something disgusting, but this? She hadn't expected this. Miles sighed as if explaining something to a slow student. "You know how expensive animal testing is. Takes too long, too many regulations." He held up the syringe, the clear liquid inside catching the light. "But you're perfect. A disposable little lab rat." Imani's heart pounded against her ribs. She had spent her whole life training for physical fights, but this was a different kind of war, and she was losing. She needed more information, more proof. So she took a slow breath and forced herself to say, "I thought the drugs were tested on animals." Miles laughed. Not the mocking kind of laugh. No, this was worse. It was amused, like she had just said something adorable. "Animals," he scoffed, rolling up her sleeve like she was some science experiment. "That's old school. We've been using human trials for months now." Imani's breath hitched. Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to break his goddamn face into pieces. But she needed to hear him say it. So she clenched her fists and asked, "What happened to the others?" Miles paused for a fraction of a second. Then he shrugged. "They died," he said, so casually it made her stomach churn. Her blood turned to ice. Maya had been one of them. Her sister, her brilliant, kind, selfless sister, had been nothing more than a disposable lab rat to this monster. And she had died because of it. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. She had known Maya was murdered, but hearing it from his own mouth, it made something inside her snap. Then, as if it was just another Tuesday, Miles muttered, "Didn't think you'd survive the last dose." The last dose. Imani's entire world tilted. Her stomach dropped. He thought she was Maya. And that meant Maya had already gone through this. Already been injected. And Miles had expected her to die. Imani froze. Her sister hadn't just been a test subject, she had been a target, and now so was she. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She lunged, faster than even she expected. Her fist collided with Miles's face so hard that he barely had time to register the impact before his head whipped back, smashing against the desk. The syringe flew from his hand, shattering against the ground. He groaned, hand flying up to his nose, blood dripping between his fingers. Imani wasn't done. She grabbed him by the collar and yanked him forward, her face inches from his. "You killed my sister," she snarled, voice shaking with rage. Miles's eyes widened. Realization dawned. "Imani," he croaked. She didn't let him process it. Her knuckles met his jaw, sending him sprawling back onto the desk, gasping. Then, before she could land another hit, the door burst open. Guards. A lot of them. And for the first time since this all began, Imani knew she wouldn't be walking out of here freely. Miles Carter was still groaning, clutching his bloodied nose when the guards burst into the office. Imani barely registered their footsteps. Her heartbeat was a war drum in her ears. There were 4 of them, all wearing security uniforms with their hands on their weapons. "Step away from Mr. Carter now," one of them barked. Imani's eyes flicked toward Miles, still writhing in pain on the floor. His white shirt was splattered with his own blood, his expensive suit now crumpled like discarded trash. He deserved worse. But Imani wasn't done yet. She turned back to the guards, her fists tightening. "Lady, last warning, get on the ground." Imani exhaled slowly, then launched herself forward. The first guard lunged clumsily, reaching for her arm. Big mistake. She sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and used his own momentum against him, twisting him off balance before slamming a sharp elbow into his ribs. The air whooshed out of his lungs as he stumbled back, gasping. Before he could recover, Imani's fist smashed into his jaw, a brutal right hook that sent him crashing onto Miles's expensive desk. 1 down. The second guard rushed her from the left, swinging a baton. She ducked. The baton sliced through the air, barely missing her head. Before he could reset, she drove a fist into his stomach, making him double over with a choked grunt. Then she grabbed the back of his head and slammed it down onto her knee. His nose crunched as blood splattered onto the pristine carpet. 2 down. The third guy was more cautious, circling her like a predator waiting for an opening. She could see it in his stance. He was hesitating. Good, she let him think he had a chance. The moment he lunged, she feinted left, dropped low, and swept his legs out from under him. He hit the floor hard, his head bouncing against the polished wood. 3 down. The last guy took a single step back. Imani wiped the blood off her knuckles. "You really want to be next?" His eyes darted toward Miles, who was groaning like a dying animal in the corner. Then, without another word, the guard turned and bolted out the door. Imani smirked. "Thought so." A pained groan snapped her focus back to Miles. She turned just in time to see the bastard scrambling for the door, one hand fumbling with the doorknob, the other still clutching his bloodied nose. "Oh, hell no." She snatched a glass paperweight from the desk and launched it. Smash. It shattered against the doorframe, missing his head by inches. Miles froze. Slowly he turned back toward her, his face a mangled mess of terror and disbelief. For the first time he looked afraid. "Sit your ass down." Imani snarled, her breathing ragged. Miles didn't argue. He staggered back, gripping the arm of his chair for support, his eyes wide with fear. For the first time, Miles Carter obeyed. But then the sound of heavy footsteps, more guards, and behind them, the police. Imani turned toward the hallway just in time to see 5 uniformed officers flooding into the office, guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them. Get on the ground, now." She barely had time to react before red dots of laser sights flickered across her chest. Her breath hitched. She had fought her entire life, but this was a different kind of fight. A fight she couldn't win with her fists. Imani's pulse hammered in her ears. If she so much as twitched the wrong way, she'd be dead before she hit the floor. So she forced her body to go still. Slowly she dropped to her knees, hands behind her head. Her pride burned. Her knuckles were raw, her lip was split, but she had no choice. She had to play this smart. A pair of rough hands grabbed her wrists, yanking them behind her back. Cold metal cuffs snapped shut. "She's insane," Miles wailed, still holding his busted face, his voice thick with desperation. "She attacked me, tried to kill me. I want her arrested, charged, thrown in prison." One of the officers looked down at Imani. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say for yourself?" She lifted her head and smiled. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, she said, "Check my pocket." Miles froze. The officers hesitated. Then one of them reached into Imani's coat pocket and pulled out a small recording pen. A single click, and Miles Carter's own voice filled the room. "You're perfect. A disposable little lab rat." Didn't think you'd survive the last dose. We've been using human trials for months now. Silence. The kind of silence that destroys lives. The cop stared at the recording device, then at Miles, his face drained of color, and just like that the tables turned. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Sir, is this your voice?" Miles didn't speak. Couldn't. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The officer turned to his partner. "Read him his rights." A second later, the sound of handcuffs clicking shut filled the air. This time they weren't for Imani. As they hauled Miles to his feet, Imani looked him dead in the eye. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," she whispered. Miles flinched. And Imani, she smiled, because for the first time since Maya died, justice had begun. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Imani's wrists as the officers dragged her toward the door. Her knuckles ached, her jaw throbbed from where a guard had clipped her earlier, and she could still taste blood in her mouth. But none of that mattered. Not when Miles Carter was still standing, not when the bastard was still breathing. He had the nerve to smirk at her, despite the blood dripping from his busted nose, despite the swelling on his cheek where her fist had landed just moments ago. "Guess this didn't go the way you planned," Miles taunted, voice thick with arrogance. "Shame. You almost had me there." Imani clenched her jaw so hard it hurt. She wanted to knock that smug look off his face, to break every bone in his body the way he had broken Maya. But instead of screaming, instead of fighting, she did something better. She smiled. Then she reached into her pocket. The officers tensed. Their hands hovered over their weapons, ready to react. Imani ignored them. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out a small recording pen. The second she pressed play, Miles Carter's voice filled the room. "You're perfect. A disposable little lab rat. Didn't think you'd survive the last dose. We've been using human trials for months now." The effect was immediate. The entire room froze. The scientists standing around went pale, their faces draining of color. One of them, a woman in a crisp white lab coat, staggered back like she'd been slapped. The cops stiffened, their expressions shifting from neutral to sharp suspicion. And Miles. For the first time, he looked afraid. "No," Miles stumbled backward, shaking his head wildly. That's fake. She doctored that recording." One of the officers, a tall black man with a rigid posture, stepped forward, staring hard at the recording device. "Dr. Carter," he said, voice clipped. "Is this your voice?" Miles's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Silence. And then, as if he could somehow talk his way out of it, he straightened, trying to regain his composure. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he hissed. "Do you know how many powerful people I know? Do you really think they'll let this slide?" The officer didn't blink. "Sir," he said again, "is this your voice?" Miles hesitated. Imani saw it the moment he realized it was over. There was no escaping this. His body sagged slightly, the cocky smirk slipping from his face. "I want my lawyer." One of the officers exchanged a look with his partner. "Cuff him," he said simply. A second later, the sound of handcuffs clicking shut filled the air. This time they weren't for Imani. By the time the story hit the media, the entire country was in an uproar. The headlines were everywhere. "Renowned scientist arrested for human experimentation. Victims speak out." "Black scientist murdered in illegal drug trials. Her sister takes down the man responsible." "Ashton Biotech scandal. How many more victims?" The trial was swift. More witnesses came forward. More evidence surfaced. Former employees spilled every dirty secret about Ashton Biotech. Documents were uncovered, proof that Miles Carter had been illegally testing drugs on black and low-income employees, knowing they had nowhere else to turn. Maya's name was on every news channel, her face plastered on TV screens. People mourned her. They called her a hero. A martyr, a tragic victim of a system built to protect people like Miles Carter. And through it all, Imani watched. She had fought, she had won, but it didn't bring Maya back. And that was the part that hurt the most. The day of the verdict, Imani sat in the courtroom, silent, unreadable. She didn't flinch when the judge read the sentence. Life in prison, no parole. The words should have felt satisfying. They didn't. Because Maya should have been here. She should have been alive. It was a quiet morning when Imani visited Maya's grave. The cemetery was still, except for the occasional rustling of leaves, the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. She kneeled down, running her fingers over the name etched into stone. Dr. Maya Brooks, a brilliant mind, a kind heart, a stolen future. Imani exhaled, her breath shaky, her throat tight. "He paid for it," she whispered. "I made sure of it." The wind picked up, lifting the strands of her hair, cool against her tear-streaked cheeks. It almost felt like a response, like Maya was still here, watching, listening. Her fingers curled into a fist, pressing against the cold marble. "No one deserves to be treated like a test subject because of their skin color," she murmured. A long pause. Then finally she stood up, wiping at her eyes, and without looking back she walked away. Because Maya's fight was over. But Imani's had only just begun. The story of Imani and Maya Brooks is more than just a tale of revenge. It is a powerful lesson about justice, resilience, and the fight against systemic oppression. It highlights the invisible battles that so many people face, particularly those who are marginalized and treated as expendable by those in power. Maya was a brilliant scientist, a woman who dedicated her life to research, only to be betrayed by the very institution she trusted. Her story is not just about her death. It is about the struggles she endured while she was alive. The racism, the microaggressions, the way she was treated as inferior despite her intelligence and talent. These are realities that many people of color face in workplaces across the world. Imani's journey teaches us an important lesson about fighting for what's right, even when the odds are against you. She was not a lawyer. She was not a detective. She had no legal power, no institutional backing. Yet she refused to accept the false narrative that her sister had overdosed. She refused to let the system bury Maya's truth. This story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many people like Maya exist in real life, silenced, mistreated, and erased? How many corporations and institutions exploit those they deem disposable? And how many of us look the other way when injustices happen right in front of us? Imani could have given up. She could have accepted the loss of her sister, swallowed the pain, and moved on. Many people do, because fighting back is hard. It's terrifying. It can cost you everything. But she chose to fight. Her resilience is a reminder that justice is never handed to the oppressed. It must be taken. The world doesn't change because people ask nicely. It changes because people like Imani refuse to be silent. It changes when the oppressed force the powerful to face their crimes. Even though Maya did not survive, her legacy did. She became a symbol, a face for countless others who had suffered in silence. And Imani ensured that her name would never be forgotten. At its core, this story is a call to action. It urges us to pay attention, to listen to the stories of the unheard, to question authority when things don't seem right, to challenge racism, discrimination, and exploitation wherever we see it. It reminds us that justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, it's about protecting the innocent. And most of all, it tells us this: every life matters the same. No one deserves to be treated as less than human, not because of their skin color, not because of their background, not because of their lack of power. We all have a responsibility to fight for a world where people like Maya don't just survive, but thrive.